Hello everyone. Today we're going to go through the process of setting up a small test network test domain between a domain controller and a workstation. This is basically a very small domain deployment. It's going to be just a single domain controller and one workstation joined to it. And we're going to go through all the steps of that process too, so that you can set up your own little test environment for testing of anything from group policy to Active Directory to anything having to do with really large environments or even small businesses. Sometimes will use Active Directory, though I think a simple work group is typically what's used in smaller business environments. But when you get into larger scale environments, a domain is much more common. And this process here today is going to be walking through all the steps required in order to set up a domain for functional testing. Now, my environment here is going to be set up just using a small Hyper-V deployment on Windows 10 client-side Hyper-V. It's going to have a Server 2012 server as well as a Windows 10 workstation. I decided to go with Server 2012 in this case, just simply because it was the first thing that I just simply had available here. It is the lowest server operating system still supported by Microsoft now that Server 2008 has long been retired, but it is still supported and due to be supported for some time. And the process of setting this up, the entire domain, even on newer server operating systems, is about the same, if not very, very similar, including all the steps of the wizard for Server 2016, Server 2019, as well as I'm sure future versions as well. So there might be a few minor differences in how some of the pages look and some of the steps, but for the most part, the process is the same. So if you see what I have on the screen at the moment here, I have my small Windows Server 2012 system here and my little Windows 10 virtual machine right here. Now, of course, when you do a brand new install of the operating system, which is the case on both of these, the only thing that's really been done is some Windows updates that have been done on the deployment image that I use for going through and setting up virtual machines. But effectively, these are just blank slate operating system installed, nothing else set up configured except for the name of my domain controller. I do recommend that you go through and set the name of your server before going through and doing the rest of the steps here, simply because that just makes managing things down the line a little bit easier. But by default, all workstations and servers get this long randomly generated name. And if you go through and set up your domain controller on your server with that name, then that's actually the name it's going to put into your Active Directory and DNS environment. And you'll have to go through the extra steps of having to rename that to something more logical later. So a good idea to go through and set the computer name of your server before going through and doing the rest of these steps, just to avoid the hassle of doing that. Of course, it is possible to go through and change the name of a domain controller, but as I'm sure you would read up on if you just do a little search, it is a bit of a process to do that. And in actual production environments, that process can actually be quite difficult and can sometimes have some major consequences. So it's not typically recommended. So all of that being said, we're going to go ahead and step right into the process here. So want to make sure that both of these systems are on the same network segment so that they'll be able to communicate. And the first step that we're going to do on our Windows Server 2012 system is we're going to go ahead and go to Add Roles and Features. We're going to skip by the first page here and select the role-based or feature-based installation and select our current server here that we see. And the role that we want to install here is Active Directory Domain Services, which of course is going to require the rest of these roles and features be installed as part of actually setting this up on this server. So we're going to accept the defaults on this, say Add Features, Next, 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 and Install. So this is basically going to set up the actual server features to allow us to either join this server to an existing domain and become a domain controller, or in our case at this moment, we're going to be creating a new for us in a new domain that this domain controller is going to be hosting. Now this feature is only going to take a minute to go through and install. My test environment isn't the fastest in the world. I just have an SSD that runs the storage for both machines and a Core i7 and 32 gigabytes of memory. 4 gigabytes is assigned to each one of these machines here. So nothing too resource intensive. I think that most desktops that have at least 16 gigabytes of memory, if not, maybe more than that, or there's a lot of different ways of how you can go through and set up your environment. But I do recommend leaving at least 4 gigabytes of memory for each virtual machine, and don't forget about the performance of your storage, as when it comes to virtualization, that usually ends up being a major bottleneck. So we have our role installation finished here, and we have our link right here on this page, promote this server to a domain controller. So we're going to go ahead and select that. Now, if we were adding this to an existing domain, then we would choose one of these top options here. But since we are starting from scratch, we're going to choose our option here of add a new forest. And I'm going to go ahead and call this my itheroes.local domain. I do specifically recommend using .local when it comes to setting up on your domain here, because if you attempt to use .com or any well-known website domain out there, what it's going to do is it's going to try to check for a delegation of that. It's going to see if there's an existing domain out there for that, and if this server has rights to go through and actually either join or host a DNS zone for that. So those are routable addresses, and so if you use a .local, it knows that .local is not routable on the internet. It is not, you can't have a website of Google.local out there and that allow people to get to your website. So .local is a nice thing to use for going through and using for test domains, because it avoids any trickiness when it comes to that delegation check that you'll see in just a moment. So we'll put in itheroes.local and we will hit next. It's going to take just a moment to go through and accept that, and then it's going to ask us for a couple of questions here. Once again, we are running this on server 2012, so our highest forest and domain functional level that we can do is going to be server 2012 R2 here. We could put this down to a lower level, but of course that's not going to be beneficial and definitely not recommended in our case. Now, for this password here, this is your Active Directory Domain Services Restore password. This is very, very important. Whether it is a test environment or a production environment, the password that you use for this could be very important down the line if you need to recover from some kind of a bad situation, if a test goes wrong, or any number of different circumstances. So do make sure to make a note of the password that you use for this here. So I'm going to go ahead and put that password in, and we'll do next. This is where that delegation check I was talking about a moment ago happens. You notice delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone could not be found. This is exactly what we want for a .local, as it's not seeing anything out there that's using this name already, which means that we are okay to start from scratch and use this for our local domain. So we will hit next, and when this pops up here with the NetBIOS domain name of itheroes.local, which it should do in just a moment, we will accept that default and hit next. Now we're just waiting for this wizard to go through and complete here. This right here. So some out there say that some best practices for Active Directory is to actually install your sysvol and these folders on a different drive location than your base drive. That's just following production best practices. In our small test environment here, we'll go ahead and accept the defaults on this. So now we get our review selections page here. We can basically see all this, and a neat thing, in case you plan on actually doing this multiple times in the future or spinning up multiple environments, you can actually hit this view script button right here, and you can see through PowerShell the whole script that would be used in order to go through and complete this whole wizard process that we just went through and did. So we'll go ahead and hit next now. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to go through and process, but here soon, this will become a domain controller for a brand new forest and domain of itheroes.local. There we go. All of our prerequisite checks are done, so we will hit install. Now this also doesn't take all that long to go through and complete. And what's going to happen once this wizard is actually finished running is it's going to want to restart this server immediately. And one of the main reasons for that is because promoting a server to be a domain controller makes a significant change to the functionality of that server regarding user logons. Standard workstations and servers have what's called a SAM database. That's your local password and account database, so that you can create local users and and set their passwords, and someone can log on to that workstation or server with those accounts that you create locally. But when a server becomes a domain controller, that same account database is actually removed, or at least access is forbidden on that, and it becomes only part of the domain, and only domain accounts can actually be used to access and manage that server. So when this process here of setting up the domain is complete, the server is immediately going to want to restart, because technically our session that we're actually running on the server, just using the built-in local administrator account, is no longer going to be valid, because our local administrator account is not part of our domain. We will need to use a domain administrator account to go through and administer this server going forward once this process here is complete. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, a couple of warnings that are popping up here all can be just ignored about our test environment here. The biggest one in the middle here, the computer has at least one physical network adapter, does not have a static IP. That is something to keep in mind, and how you set up your IP scope and what IP addresses you use for your test environment is completely up to you, so long as things can communicate. In my particular instance here, this is just a small test domain for a small purpose, so I've actually just left this on DHCP for the moment, but I will likely switch this over to a static IP on the domain controller soon, because what can happen if you leave DHCP set up on your domain controller is you have your workstations that load up, try to actually access the domain, and then all of a sudden they don't know how to if the IP address of the domain controller has changed. So that's something to keep in mind for IP addresses, and we'll talk about that more here soon. But you'll see here, you're about to be signed out. Windows will shut down in less than a minute. And that is, once again, because our local session on that server is technically no longer valid, because we are becoming a domain controller. So we will see our machine restart now, and it should come up here shortly. And what you'll see is when it actually does come up is the default account it's going to want us to log in with is just the administrator account. However, it's not the administrator account for this local server anymore. It is the administrator account for our IT Heroes domain. And you will see that in just a moment once this finishes waiting. More like while we finish waiting here, of course, because it seems like Microsoft is always telling us to please wait. At least they're nice about it. Now, in the meantime, while that's loading, I'm just going to pop over to the workstation for just a moment in the show. I've already run an IP config over on this workstation, and I had one over on the server a moment ago as well, but wasn't thinking about it needing to restart. So not a bad idea at this point to just check and make sure that your network and IP addresses and everything are all set up as you would expect to be functional and to be able to communicate. The easiest thing in the world is just to make sure that they are on the same subnet. So for example, I am on a 192.168.1 subnet here, pretty standard class C that most people have in their environments, though of course there are some different configurations, and different devices sometimes have different default networks. But a major important thing to keep in mind is the IP address scope that you're going through and using, because we're going to start going over one thing to prepare for joining this workstation to the domain. So for this workstation to join the domain, it has to be able to find the domain, and how it does that is using DNS. So what we're going to do is we need to make sure that this is able to resolve the name of itheroes.local. That is not something it's going to get from its local DNS or from its from the internet or anything like that, because this is an entity that only exists on our local network. So before we can join this workstation to the new domain, we need to tell this workstation how to even find that domain. And the way that we do that is by changing the DNS server that is used by our workstation here, so that it knows how to actually find our domain controller. So real quick, I'll finish that in just a moment, but let's go ahead and see. Here we go. IT Heroes /administrator, and we will log in with that account just to make sure that everything is working as we would expect to see there. Take just a moment to load up, and then our server manager is going to load up here, and then we're just going to open up Active Directory just to verify that it is installed and functional here. And there we go. So with that, we have an itheroes.local domain, but we don't have any user accounts, computer objects, anything in this. This is as empty as a domain possibly gets. It's literally a domain on a single domain controller, and that is all that exists in this environment here. So we want to join our workstation to this domain, and the way that we're going to do that is first we need to know what the IP address of our domain controller is. So this is where I'm going to go ahead and go to the Network and Sharing Center. I only have a single network card on this virtual server here, so we'll go into that. We're going to go into Properties. We'll go to IPv4, and we see here local preferred DNS server is 127.0.0.1, and that is to be expected. That is the address for localhost, meaning that our domain controller here is looking at itself to resolve DNS entries, and that is exactly how that should be. This is a good opportunity, if you haven't already, to go ahead and specify a static IP address on the server if that's something that you plan on doing. And again, like I said, I highly recommend. I'm going to, just for the case of this video right now, leave it at DHCP, because even with DHCP, I do have a valid IP4 address that I can use at least to go through and join this workstation to this domain. So this right here is the IP address of my brand new domain controller. So we'll pop over to our network connections on the Windows 10 workstation. We'll go to the properties for our network connection. Again, there's only one on this. It's a very simple virtual machine. We're going to go to the properties for IPv4. And the only thing I need to do here is use the following DNS server addresses. Now let me scoot that over just so I can see a little bit more clearly there. There we go. So now I'm going to put in 192. Oh, always got to get that numlock. That's one thing always happens with Hyper-V, is it loves to mess with your numlock. So 192.168.1.68. And we can leave the alternate DNS server just unchecked for right now. Or if you just want to make sure that this server will be able to do things on the internet, just in case you can't even reach the domain controller, not a bad idea to just go ahead and put an alternate DNS server here using Google's, which is 8.8.8.8. So that being specified here, we are going to go ahead and close our network properties, close our IP config, and now we are ready to actually join this system over to our domain. So the way we're going to do that is going into, I just like to go to right-clicking on the start menu there and going to system. There are a few different ways of actually going through and doing this, but if we go into here and then rename my PC, we don't have an option with this for going through and renaming the PC. And this is something that if you're familiar with previous versions of Windows on, now this will let you change the name of just this workstation, but doesn't allow you to actually change the to join a domain. We need to go a little bit different area. We need to actually go to the system info here. So don't let the rename this PC fool you and thinking that you can't join a domain. You just need to go to the system info here. And then from here, this is where we can go to change settings. And we can go to change. And our domain, we're going to do itheroes. Oh, let me make sure I'm spelling that right. Okay. And we will say OK. And this is where we need to put in the credentials of our administrator account and that password that you specified earlier. Say OK. Oop, I must have made a mistake with that password. Let me try that again. And you know, one thing that's not a bad idea to do is just to put the domain prefix, just so that it's not trying to use the local administrator account credentials on this machine. And there we are. Welcome to the itheroes.local domain. Now, one major thing to just keep in mind, if you run into an error message at this point where it's saying that it can't find the domain, you'll get a little error box with a red X on it. That is one of the most common issues that people have in going through and just trying to set up a domain test environment, and that usually comes down to a problem with the IP address and DNS that I spent so much time talking about. DNS needs to be able to resolve the name of itheroes.local in order for this workstation to join that domain. And how it does that is by us going through and specifying our domain controller as the DNS server for this workstation. So what that means is that when we try to tell this to join the itheroes.local domain, the first thing it does is tries to figure out where the itheroes local domain is, and it does that by doing a DNS query, which is received by our itheroes domain controller. The domain controller responds with its own information, its own IP address, and then that allows this workstation to communicate with that domain, join, and become part of the itheroes domain. So we'll say OK on our message boxes here. We'll say close and restart now. And this workstation is going to take just a moment to go through and restart. And Hyper-V, of course, sometimes gets a little ahead of itself and trying to go through and reconnect the window over to the workstation while it's running. But there we are, loading up. And now, when we actually are presented with our login screen, we still have the ability to, on this workstation, log in with just the local user account I created during the operating system install, which creatively I just named user. But if we go to other user, we now see that our default option to sign in is itheroes. And we are presented with a username and password. So what I'm going to simply do on this workstation right now is verify that I can log in with the itheroes administrator account. Quick little note on this. If I type in administrator, notice how at the bottom it changes to sign into, and it changes this over to this local workstation's name. And that's because by default, when you put administrator, the operating system thinks that you're trying to sign into the local administrator account. Now, if we want to sign into the domain administrator account, what we need to do is simply put that domain prefix on. So itheroes/administrator. And then, of course, our password. And then it should allow us to do our first ever domain logon on this workstation. And while that's going through and loading over there, we will clean up our mess over here. And what I just want to do is jump over here, and we now see under our computers area, our desktop, our workstation that has now successfully joined this domain. So again, somewhat simple process of going through and setting up a basic server domain controller and join a workstation to it. The most complicated and trickiest step, and probably the step that is either not misunderstood the most or simply forgotten, is about how to go through and set up the DNS on the workstation to be your domain controller. And there are other steps in order to really make things much more functional, but that is the main requirement that is needed in order to go through and set this up so that you can actually join a workstation to the domain and begin actually working in a test domain environment. So hopefully that covers everything that is needed for you to set up your test environment. If you have any suggestions, better methods, or questions about anything, put that in the comments below. And otherwise, continue being an IT hero and best of luck.